Some moments change everything we thought we knew about the world. For Jacob Stone, that moment came when he walked through his cabin door after 3 months in the wilderness. There sat his 8-year-old son beside a Cheyenne woman, her gentle voice helping him sound out words from a tattered book. Jacob had spent 15 years in these Colorado mountains, believing he could raise his boy alone, far from the complications of civilization. He'd built walls around their simple life, convinced that isolation meant safety. But watching his son's face light up with each new word, seeing the patience in this stranger's eyes, Jacob realized that sometimes the very thing we fear most might be exactly what we need. This woman had risked everything to bring learning to his child. Now Jacob must decide if he'll let down the walls he's built or lose the chance to give his son something he never had himself. What happens when a man's deepest prejudices collide with a parent's love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hunting knife at Jacob's belt had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. 3 generations of stone men had carved their survival from these unforgiving mountains with its worn steel blade. Jacob's calloused fingers found its familiar weight as he stood frozen in his own doorway. Watching the impossible scene unfold before him, the woman's back was turned toward him, her long black hair braided with small beads that caught the afternoon light streaming through the cabin's single window. She wore buckskin that had been worked soft as silk, painted with symbols Jacob didn't recognize but somehow found beautiful. Her voice was low and musical as she guided his son Thomas through the mysteries of written words. "Sound it out slowly," she said, her English clear but touched with an accent that made each word seem deliberate and important. "Take your time. The letters will wait for you." Thomas bent his sandy head over the book, his small finger tracing beneath each letter. "C-A-T, he said carefully. "Cat, very good. And what sound does a cat make?" "Meow." Thomas giggled, a sound that hit Jacob square in the chest. When was the last time he'd heard his boy laugh like that? Pure joy, untainted by the loneliness that seemed to hang around their cabin like morning mist. Jacob had built this cabin with his own hands 8 years ago, after Sarah died giving birth to Thomas. He'd chosen this spot deliberately, high enough that the winter snows would keep most folks away, remote enough that a man could raise his son without interference from a world that had already taken too much from him. The nearest settlement was Bent Creek, a hard day's ride through treacherous mountain passes, and Jacob made the journey maybe 3 times a year for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. The cabin was solid work. Thick log walls chinked tight against the wind, a stone fireplace that drew clean, and a roof that had weathered 7 hard winters without leaking. Jacob had carved every beam, fitted every joint, thinking each strike of his axe was another barrier between his boy and the heartache that seemed to follow civilization, like buzzards follow dying cattle. Inside, their life was simple but sufficient. 2 rope beds in the loft, a sturdy table Jacob had hewn from a single oak trunk, shelves that held their few precious possessions, Sarah's Bible, though Jacob couldn't read it, a tintype of Sarah holding newborn Thomas, his father's rifle that had never missed when it mattered. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, of the herbs Jacob dried each fall, and the venison that hung in the cold cellar he'd dug into the hillside. But now, watching this stranger with his son, Jacob realized their simple life might not be enough. Thomas was 8 years old, curious as a raccoon, and lately he'd been asking questions Jacob couldn't answer. Questions about letters and numbers, about the world beyond their mountain, about why other children lived differently than they did. "Papa says letters are just chicken scratches," Thomas had said one evening, staring at his mother's Bible with longing in his young eyes. "But I think they must mean something important, or why would Mama have stared at them so long?" Jacob had felt something twist in his gut at those words. Sarah had been educated, could read and write as fine as any lady in Denver. She tried to teach Jacob during their brief marriage, But he'd been too proud, too convinced that book learning was for soft men who couldn't survive on their own strength. After she died, he'd promised himself he'd teach Thomas what mattered: how to hunt, how to track, how to read weather and animal signs. Real knowledge, not the useless scribblings of men who'd never felt their belly gnaw with true hunger. But looking at his son now, seeing the concentration on his small face as he worked through each word, Jacob wondered if he'd been wrong about what kind of knowledge truly mattered. The woman, who was she? How long had she been coming here? Jacob's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. The Cheyenne had hunting grounds that overlapped these mountains, but they usually kept to the lower elevations in winter, following the game down to the valleys. Individual Cheyenne didn't just wander into a white man's cabin to teach his child to read. Unless Jacob's blood chilled. Unless this was some kind of trap. Maybe she was scouting for a war party, learning their routines, their weaknesses. God knew there'd been enough trouble between whites and Indians over the past few years. The army was always riding through Bent Creek with news of raids, burned homesteads, families taken or killed. But even as his suspicious mind conjured these dark possibilities, Jacob couldn't square them with what he was witnessing. The woman's posture spoke of patience, not deception. Her hands, as she turned the pages of the worn book, were gentle and careful. This was not the behavior of someone planning harm. "What's this word, Thomas?" she asked, pointing to something on the page. Thomas squinted at it, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration, a habit he'd inherited from his mother. "Dioji? Dog?" "Exactly right. You're learning so quickly." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Jacob felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. When was the last time he'd praised Thomas with such warmth? When was the last time he'd sat with his son and really listened, really paid attention to the quick mind working behind those bright blue eyes? Jacob's father had raised him with a stern hand and few words of encouragement. "Boy learns by doing," the old man used to say. "Life will teach him what he needs to know, and praise just makes a man soft." Jacob had followed the same philosophy with Thomas, believing that frontier life demanded toughness above all else. But watching this woman with his son, Jacob began to question everything he thought he knew about raising a boy. There was strength in gentleness, he realized. There was power in patience. This stranger was giving Thomas something Jacob had never thought to offer, the gift of feeling smart, capable, worthy of careful attention. The afternoon light was starting to fade, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber. Soon, Jacob would need to tend to his horse, unpack the supplies he'd brought back from his trapping run, prepare supper for himself and Thomas. But he couldn't bring himself to move from the doorway. Part of him was afraid that if he stepped forward, if he made his presence known, this magical scene would shatter like ice on a warm stone. He studied the woman more carefully, trying to read the story written in her posture, her clothes, her careful way of speaking. She was young, maybe 25 or 30, but there was something in her manner that spoke of experiences beyond her years. Her buckskin dress was well made, but showed signs of hard travel. Her moccasins were worn but expertly repaired. This was someone who knew how to take care of herself in the wilderness. More puzzling was the book itself. Jacob could see it was a simple primer, the kind missionaries sometimes brought to Indian schools. The pages were soft with handling, some of them torn and mended. How had a Cheyenne woman come by such a thing? How had she learned to read well enough to teach others? And why? This was the question that gnawed at him most. Why would she risk everything to teach a white child? If her people discovered what she was doing, she could face exile or worse. If hostile whites found her here alone with Thomas, the consequences could be deadly for all of them. "I think that's enough for today," the woman said softly, closing the book with careful reverence. "Your eyes are getting tired." Thomas looked up at her with obvious adoration. "Will you come back tomorrow, Ayana? Will you teach me more words?" Ayana. So that was her name. Something about the way Thomas said it, comfortable and familiar, told Jacob this had been going on for more than just a day or two. How many times had this woman been in his home while he was away? How many lessons had he missed? How many small moments of his son's growing up? "I will come if I can," Ayana replied, and Jacob heard something guarded in her tone. "But Thomas, you must remember what we talked about. Not everyone would understand about our lessons." "I remember," Thomas said solemnly. "It's our secret." Jacob felt another twist in his chest. His son was keeping secrets from him. When had that started? When had Thomas learned to hide things, to navigate complicated adult emotions that no 8-year-old should have to understand? The knife at Jacob's belt seemed heavier now, not a tool of survival, but a reminder of all the barriers he'd built between himself and the world. He thought of his father, who died bitter and alone, trusting no one, suspicious of everything new or different. Was that the legacy Jacob wanted to pass to Thomas? A life of isolation, of fear disguised as self-reliance. Taking a deep breath, Jacob finally stepped forward into his own cabin. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and both Thomas and Ayana turned toward the sound. "Papa!" Thomas scrambled to his feet, his face lighting up with joy. "You're home early." But Jacob's eyes were fixed on the woman called Ayana, who had risen gracefully to her feet and now stood perfectly still, like a deer that's caught the scent of a predator. Her dark eyes met his, and Jacob saw no fear there, only a quiet dignity and something that might have been hope. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and the weight of worlds about to collide. Finally, Jacob found his voice. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I believe you and I need to have ourselves a talk." Ayana's hand moved instinctively to the small leather pouch at her waist, a medicine bag her grandmother had made, filled with sage and sweetgrass and the kind of prayers that had kept her people strong through countless hardships. She'd carried it through 3 winters of hiding, through the long months of grief after the cavalry came, through the dangerous journey that had brought her to this remote mountain. Now, facing Jacob Stone's weathered face and uncertain eyes, she drew strength from its familiar weight. "Thomas," Jacob said quietly, his voice carefully controlled, "why don't you go check on the horses? Make sure they have enough feed for the night." The boy looked between his father and Ayana, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the cabin like smoke from a green log. "But Papa, I want to show you how good I can read now. I can read almost a whole page without—" "Thomas!" Jacob's tone brooked no argument. "The horses, now!" With a disappointed sigh, Thomas gathered his coat and stepped outside, leaving the 2 adults alone in the gathering dusk. Jacob moved to the fireplace and began building up the flames, his movements deliberate and precise. Ayana remained standing by the table, her spine straight, ready for whatever accusation or threat might come. "How long?" Jacob asked without turning around. 6 weeks, Ayana replied honestly. "Maybe 7. Since the first big snow." Jacob absorbed this information, poking at the fire with more force than necessary. "And you've been coming here while I was away? Into my home? With my son?" "Yes." Her simple honesty seemed to catch him off guard. He turned to face her, his blue eyes searching her face for deception. "Why?" Ayana had asked herself that same question every day for the past month and a half. The truthful answer was complicated, layered with grief and loneliness and a desperate need to do something good in a world that had shown her too much darkness. "I found him during the blizzard 3 days before the new moon," she began. "I was hunting deer in the valley below when I heard crying. Your son was outside in the storm, trying to bring in firewood. He was so cold his hands wouldn't work properly." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd been gone longer than planned on that particular trip, following a promising beaver stream deeper into the wilderness. "He knows better than to go out in weather like that." "He was scared," Ayana said simply. "The fire had died, and he didn't know how to restart it properly. When I found him, he was weeping because he thought you might come home to find him frozen." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He sank into one of the wooden chairs he'd made, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. "I taught him about fires. I taught him—" "You taught him many things," Ayana interrupted gently. "But he is 8 years old, and 8-year-old boys sometimes panic when they are alone and afraid." She moved closer, her moccasins silent on the rough plank floor. I helped him restart the fire and waited until the storm passed. I was preparing to leave when I saw the book. Sarah's book, Jacob said quietly. He was holding it like it contained magic. He asked me if I knew what the marks meant, if I could tell him the stories hidden inside. Ayana's voice softened with memory. The longing in his voice, I recognized it. I felt the same way once, before the missionaries taught me to read. Jacob looked up sharply. Missionaries? At the school in Colorado Springs. I was sent there when I was 12, after my parents died of the spotted fever. The white teachers said they would civilize me, make me into something better than what I was. The old bitterness crept into her voice. They tried to take away my name, my language, my prayers. But they also gave me something precious, the ability to unlock the secrets in books. She pulled the worn primer from beneath her shawl, holding it like the treasure it had become. This belonged to a friend at the school. She died of the lung sickness in our 3rd year, but before she passed, she made me promise to use what we had learned to help others. So you decided to help my boy. I decided to honor my friend's memory. Ayana set the book on the table between them. Thomas has a hungry mind, Mr. Stone. He soaks up knowledge like dry earth soaks up rain. In 6 weeks he has learned what took me 6 months to master at the school. Jacob stared at the book as if it might bite him. I don't know anything about book learning. I can't even read my own name. The admission cost him, Ayana could see. His pride was wounded by having to speak this truth to a stranger, especially one his own people would consider inferior. But she heard something else in his voice, regret, maybe even shame. Your son doesn't judge you for that, she said softly. He speaks of you with great love and respect. He tells me about the things you've taught him, how to track animals, how to read the weather, how to find his way by the stars. These are valuable skills. Not valuable enough, apparently. Jacob's voice was rough with self-recrimination. If they were, he wouldn't need you. Ayana studied his profile in the firelight. She had expected anger, threats, maybe violence when this moment finally came. She had not expected vulnerability. This man was not the hard, unfeeling mountain dweller she had imagined. He was a father struggling with his own limitations, trying to do right by a son he clearly loved. He doesn't need me, she said carefully, but he wants to learn and I can teach him. The question is whether you will allow it. Jacob was quiet for so long that Ayana began to wonder if he had heard her. Outside, she could hear Thomas talking to the horses in the steady, companionable way of someone who spent a lot of time alone. Inside, the fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the log walls. My wife could read, Jacob finally said. She used to sit by that window every evening with her book, moving her lips slightly as she followed the words. I always meant to ask her to teach me, but he shrugged helplessly. There never seemed to be time. And then she was gone. It's not too late, Ayana ventured. I could teach you as well as Thomas. Jacob's laugh was short and bitter. A grown man learning his letters from... He stopped abruptly, but the unfinished sentence hung between them like a drawn blade. From an Indian woman, Ayana finished quietly. Yes, I understand how that would look to your people. It's not about how it looks, Jacob said, but they both knew he was lying. Then what is it about? Another long silence. When Jacob spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if you're wrong? What if I can't learn? What if I'm too stupid, too set in my ways? The raw honesty in his question touched something deep in Ayana's chest. She had seen this same fear in her own reflection during those first terrifying weeks at the missionary school, when everything familiar had been stripped away and she was expected to become something entirely new. Then we will discover that together, she said simply. But I don't think you're stupid, Mr. Stone. A stupid man couldn't have built this cabin. He couldn't have survived alone in these mountains for 8 years. Couldn't have raised such a bright, curious son. Thomas's voice drifted in from outside, singing some made-up song about horses and snow and brave mountain men. The sound made both adults smile, despite the tension between them. He's lonely, Jacob said, more to himself than to Ayana. I see it sometimes, the way he watches other children when we go to town. The way he asks questions about families with mothers, about school, about things I can't give him. Loneliness is not a failing, Ayana said gently. I have been lonely too, since my family was killed. Perhaps that is why Thomas and I understand each other. Jacob looked at her sharply. Killed? By soldiers. They said we were harboring hostile warriors, but we were only trying to survive the winter. Her voice remained steady, but her hand tightened around her medicine pouch. I was away gathering roots when it happened. I returned to find she stopped, unable to finish. I'm sorry, Jacob said, and meant it. Whatever his feelings about Indians in general, he understood the particular grief of losing family. That's a hard burden to carry. Yes, but helping Thomas learn has made the burden lighter. Watching his face when he masters a new word, it reminds me that there is still good in the world, still reasons to hope. The door opened and Thomas bounded back inside, his cheeks red from the cold. The horses are fine, Papa. Old Buck says hello. He stopped, looking between the two adults. Are you angry at Ayana? Please don't be angry. She's been so kind to me. Jacob felt his heart squeeze tight. His son's earnest face, his protective stance in front of his teacher. When had Thomas learned to care so deeply for someone outside their small family? I'm not angry, son, Jacob said slowly. Ayana and I were just talking about things. Thomas brightened immediately. Does that mean she can keep teaching me? I'm getting really good, Papa. Want to see? Jacob looked at Ayana, seeing the hope in her dark eyes, the way she held herself ready for either acceptance or rejection. He thought of his father, who had died without ever knowing the stories in his mother's old Bible. He thought of Thomas, bright and eager and deserving of every opportunity Jacob could give him. All right, he said finally. But we're going to set some rules. Jacob's calloused hands moved slowly across the pine board, his hunting knife carving careful grooves into the soft wood. Each letter took him nearly an hour to complete, not because the shapes were difficult, but because he wanted them perfect. These wooden letters would be Thomas's first real learning tools. Something permanent they could return to day after day, B.C. The alphabet felt foreign on his tongue as he whispered each letter's name. The way Ayana had taught him during their first awkward lesson 3 days ago. She'd been patient then too, just as she was with Thomas, never showing frustration when Jacob stumbled over sounds that came naturally to his 8-year-old son. The knife work is beautiful, Ayana said from across the cabin, where she was mending one of Thomas's shirts by lamplight. Your son will treasure those letters. Jacob paused in his carving, looking up at her. In the past few days, he'd begun to notice things about her that had escaped him in that first shocking encounter. The way she moved with quiet efficiency, never wasting motion. How she seemed to anticipate Thomas's needs before the boy himself realized them. The small smile that touched her lips when Thomas successfully read a particularly difficult word. My father taught me to carve, Jacob said, returning to his work. Said a man's hands should be good for more than just killing and breaking things. Wise advice. He had his moments. Jacob tested the edge of the letter D with his thumb, though he never would have approved of this. Of me learning letters from someone like me. Ayana finished quietly. Jacob set down his knife, meeting her eyes across the room. I was going to say from anyone. My father believed book learning made men soft. Said the only education a man needed was what the wilderness could teach him. And what do you believe? It was a question Jacob had been wrestling with since agreeing to let Ayana continue Thomas's lessons. Everything he'd been raised to think told him he was making a mistake. Real men didn't need to read. Real men survived on strength and cunning, and the skills passed down from father to son for generations. But watching Thomas's face light up as he worked through simple sentences, seeing the confidence grow in his boy's voice, that was harder to argue with than any philosophy. I believe, Jacob said slowly, that I don't want my son to feel ashamed of not knowing things the way I have. The admission surprised him. He hadn't meant to be so honest, especially not with someone he barely knew. But there was something about Ayana's presence that invited truth. Maybe it was the way she listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but actually hearing what was said and what wasn't said. Shame is a heavy burden, she agreed. I carried it for many years at the mission school. Ashamed of my heritage, ashamed of my family, ashamed of the prayers my grandmother taught me. The teachers said these things were primitive, that I should be grateful to leave them behind. But you didn't. Ayana's hand went to her medicine pouch, as it often did when she spoke of difficult things. I learned to hide them instead. I became very good at being what others expected me to be, while keeping my true self locked away inside. Thomas looked up from where he was practicing writing letters in the dirt near the fireplace. That sounds lonely. It was, little one. Very lonely? Jacob felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He'd spent 8 years building walls around himself and Thomas, convinced that isolation meant safety. But what if it just meant loneliness? What if he'd been protecting his son from connections that could enrich their lives instead of endangering them? Why did you really come here? Jacob asked. And don't tell me it was just to honor your friend's memory. There are other children you could teach, closer to wherever you're hiding. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her needle suspended above Thomas's shirt. When I heard Thomas crying in the storm, when I saw how frightened he was, it reminded me of myself at his age. Scared, alone, desperate for someone to care whether I lived or died. You weren't alone. You had your people. I had people who shared my blood, Ayana corrected. That's not the same thing. After my parents died, I was passed from relative to relative, like an unwanted burden. No one was cruel, but no one truly wanted me either. When the Indian agent came to collect children for the school, my uncle practically pushed me forward. Jacob winced. He'd heard stories about the government schools, though he'd never paid much attention. Now looking at Ayana's face, he wondered what other stories he'd dismissed simply because they didn't concern white folks. Thomas is wanted, Jacob said firmly. He's loved, I know. I can see it in everything you've built here, in the way you talk to him, in the care you take with those letters you're carving. Ayana's voice was soft with something that might have been envy. He's lucky to have a father who loves him so much, lucky to have a teacher who's willing to risk everything to help him learn, Jacob replied. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. They both knew the risks involved in their arrangement. If the wrong people discovered Ayana here, if rumors spread in Bent Creek, if her own people decided she was betraying them by helping a white family, the consequences could be deadly for all of them. Papa, Thomas said suddenly, when I learn to read really good, will you let me read Mama's Bible? Jacob's throat tightened. Sarah's Bible sat on the shelf above their bed, gathering dust but still precious beyond measure. He'd never opened it since her death, partly because he couldn't read it, but mostly because it hurt too much to think about the stories she'd loved, the comfort she'd found in those pages. If that's what you want, son, I do. Ayana says there are beautiful stories in the Bible, about brave people and miracles and love that's stronger than death. Jacob's eyes found Ayana's across the room. She'd been teaching Thomas more than just letters and sounds. She'd been giving him hope, faith, reasons to believe in something beyond their small mountain world. Your mother would like that, Jacob managed. She always said those stories were important. Thomas beamed and returned to his dirt writing, carefully forming the letters Jacob was carving into wood. Father and son working toward the same goal, each in his own way. It felt like progress, like healing, like something Sarah would have approved of. The letters are ready for sanding, Jacob announced, setting down his knife. Tomorrow I'll smooth them down, and Thomas can start using them properly. He'll be so excited, Ayana said. He's been asking me every day when he'll have real letters to hold. Jacob gathered the rough-carved letters, feeling their weight in his palms. Such simple things, just shapes cut from wood, but they represented a bridge between worlds. His world of practical skills and survival. Ayana's world of knowledge and learning. Thomas's world of endless curiosity and possibility. Ayana, he said as she prepared to leave for the night. Tomorrow, when you come for Thomas's lesson, would you mind starting with me first? I'd like to learn these letters before I teach them to my boy. Her smile was like sunrise after a long, cold night. I would be honored to teach you both. As she gathered her shawl and the precious book, Jacob found himself looking forward to tomorrow's lesson with an anticipation he hadn't felt since he was Thomas's age. Maybe his father had been wrong about book learning making men soft. Maybe some kinds of strength came from opening yourself to new possibilities, even when they frightened you, maybe especially then. The beadwork on Ayana's ceremonial dress told stories that Jacob was only beginning to understand. Intricate patterns of blue and white and gold caught the firelight as she worked, her fingers moving with the same patient precision she brought to teaching. Each tiny bead had been placed with purpose, creating images that spoke of seasons and ceremonies, of ancestors and dreams. This pattern represents the journey of water, she explained to Thomas, who sat mesmerized beside her. From snow on the mountain peaks, down through streams and rivers, and finally to the great waters where all rivers meet. Thomas traced the beaded design with one small finger. Careful not to disturb any of the delicate work. It's like a story you can wear. Exactly. My grandmother taught me that everything tells a story if you know how to look at it. The rings in a tree trunk, the migration of birds, the way frost forms on windows, all stories. Jacob paused in his letter practice, studying the woman who had become such an unexpected part of their daily routine. 2 weeks had passed since he'd agreed to let her teach them, and he was starting to understand that Ayana carried an entire world of knowledge he'd never imagined existed. Not just book learning, but ancient wisdom passed down through generations of her people. What story does this pattern tell? Jacob asked, pointing to a section of geometric designs near the dress's hem. Ayana's expression grew solemn. This represents my family line. Each diamond shape is a generation, connected to the next by these smaller beads. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother. She stopped, her finger resting on a pattern that seemed unfinished, as if the story had been cut short. And you, Thomas said softly. Yes, and me. Ayana's voice was barely above a whisper. The last diamond in the pattern. When I die, this story ends. The weight of her words settled over the cabin like evening mist. Jacob had been so focused on the risks of having her here that he'd never considered what she was risking, not just her safety, but her entire heritage. If she was discovered helping a white family, if her own people cast her out, she would indeed be the end of her family's story. That's not true, Thomas said with the fierce certainty of childhood. You're teaching us your stories. Papa's learning to read, and I'm learning about patterns and water journeys and lots of things. We're part of your story now. Ayana's eyes glistened in the lamplight. You have a wise son, Mr. Stone. Gets that from his mother, Jacob said, but he felt a warm pride at Thomas's words. The boy was right in his innocent way. They were all becoming part of something larger than their individual lives. Tell us about your grandmother, Jacob found himself saying. The one who made your medicine pouch. Ayana's hand went automatically to the small leather bag at her waist. Her name was Singing Crow. She could heal with plants, predict weather by the way animals behaved, and tell stories that would make you laugh or cry or dream of impossible things. Did she teach you all of that? Some. I was only 12 when they took me to the school, so there was much I never learned. Ayana's fingers stilled on her beadwork. The teachers forbade us to speak our language, to practice our customs, to remember our families. They said we had to kill the Indian inside us to save the human. Thomas looked up sharply. That's mean. Yes, it was. But I understood later that they believed they were helping us. They thought our way of life was dying, that we needed to become like white people to survive in the changing world. Jacob felt an uncomfortable stir of recognition. Hadn't he been guilty of similar thinking? Assuming that his way, isolated, self-reliant, suspicious of outsiders, was the only way to protect his family. Were they right? He asked carefully. About your way of life dying. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her needle suspended above the beadwork. Parts of it are dying, yes. The great buffalo herds are gone. The open grasslands, where my people followed the seasons, are being divided into squares and given to homesteaders. The old ways of living are becoming impossible. But not everything, Jacob said, watching her face. No, not everything. The stories survive, the ceremonies, the knowledge of plants and animals, and the connections between all living things. These things can adapt, can find new places to grow. She looked meaningfully at Thomas, then at Jacob. Sometimes they find the most unexpected places. Thomas had been following the conversation with the serious attention he gave to all adult topics these days. Like how you're teaching me to read, but I'm also learning about water patterns and animal signs. Exactly like that, little one. Jacob set down his wooden letters, struck by a sudden realization. You're not just teaching us to read, are you? You're teaching us to see the world differently. Ayana smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Learning to read words is only the beginning. Once you can read words, you can read the stories in everything around you. The story of the mountain in the way rocks are layered. The story of a deer in the tracks it leaves. The story of a person in the way they move, the way they speak, the way they choose to live, the way they choose to trust, Jacob added quietly. Their eyes met across the warm cabin, and Jacob felt something shift between them. What had started as a practical arrangement, her teaching, his grudging acceptance, was becoming something deeper. Not just education, but connection. Not just learning, but understanding. I have something for you, Ayana said suddenly, reaching into the bag beside her chair. She pulled out a small piece of beadwork, a simple pattern of blue and white stars on a leather backing. I've been working on this in the evenings. Jacob took the piece reverently, running his thumb over the tiny beads. It's beautiful. What's it for? A bookmark. For when you start reading your wife's Bible. The gift hit Jacob harder than he'd expected. Here was a woman who had lost everything, family, home, her place in the world, and she was creating beauty for him, marking his journey into literacy with something precious and personal. This is too fine for someone like me. Someone like you. Ayana's voice carried a gentle challenge. Someone who builds safe homes for his son. Someone who carves letters from wood with the patience of a master craftsman. Someone who opens his heart to learning even when it frightens him. Thomas bounced on his toes with excitement. Papa, it matches the beadwork on Ayana's dress. That means we're part of her story pattern now, right? Ayana and Jacob looked at each other, both recognizing the truth in the boy's innocent observation. Somehow, without planning or intention, they had become woven together. White mountain man, Cheyenne woman, curious child, creating a pattern that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Yes, Ayana said softly. I think it does mean that. As the evening shadows grew longer, Jacob found himself reluctant to have Ayana leave. Not because of any romantic feeling, he wasn't ready for such complications, but because her presence had filled a gap in their lives he hadn't even known existed. Thomas was blooming under her gentle guidance, becoming more confident, more articulate, more aware of the wider world beyond their mountain. And Jacob himself was changing too, though he was only beginning to understand how much. The man who had been suspicious of all outsiders now looked forward to conversations with a Cheyenne woman. The man who had scorned book learning now practiced his letters every night. The man who had built walls to protect his family was discovering that some walls needed to come down for love to grow. Tomorrow, he said, as Ayana gathered her things, would you show Thomas how to make patterns like yours? I think he'd like to learn. Her smile was radiant. I would love to teach him, and perhaps you would like to learn as well. Jacob looked at the bookmark in his hands, at his son's eager face, at the woman who was quietly revolutionizing their lives one lesson at a time. Yes, he said. I think I would. The daguerreotype of Sarah holding newborn Thomas sat on the small shelf beside Jacob's bed, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight like a mirror of memory. Jacob had looked at it every night for 8 years, but tonight it seemed to watch him back with reproachful eyes. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, sealing them all inside the cabin with the kind of intimacy that made every gesture, every glance, every shared silence feel weighted with meaning. Ayana moved through their daily routines now with the comfortable familiarity of family, preparing meals, mending clothes, teaching lessons that had evolved far beyond simple reading into rich conversations about life, loss, and hope. And Jacob found himself watching her with feelings that made him deeply uncomfortable. She was very beautiful, Ayana said softly from beside him. Jacob startled, realizing she'd approached while he was lost in contemplation of the photograph. In the close quarters of the storm-bound cabin, such moments of accidental nearness had become common, charged with an awareness that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Yes, she was. His voice came out rougher than intended. Beautiful and kind and gone. Ayana studied the image with the same careful attention she gave to everything. Sarah's face was serene in the photograph, her arms cradling the tiny bundle of Thomas with infinite tenderness. She looked like a woman who believed in happy endings, in a future full of possibilities. She would have liked to see Thomas reading so well, Ayana observed. See how proud he is of his progress. Across the cabin, Thomas sat at the table working through a passage from his mother's Bible with determined concentration. His lips moved slightly as he read, a habit inherited from Sarah, and watching him made Jacob's chest tight with mingled pride and grief. She always said he was special, Jacob murmured. Said he had her mind and my stubbornness, and that would either make him a great man or get him into terrible trouble, perhaps both. Jacob almost smiled at that. Sarah would have said the same thing, with that gentle humor that had been one of the things he'd loved most about her. But thinking of Sarah's humor made him aware of how long it had been since he'd truly laughed, how much joy had gone out of his life when she died, until recently. Until Ayana had brought laughter back into their cabin, not through forced cheerfulness, but through the natural warmth that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a well-tended fire. I feel like I'm betraying her, Jacob said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Ayana turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious. By learning to read? By... Jacob struggled with the admission, with feelings he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. By enjoying your company. By looking forward to your visits. By thinking about things I have no business thinking about. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of Thomas reading aloud and the wind howling outside their warm sanctuary. Ayana's expression remained calm, but Jacob caught something that might have been sadness flicker across her features. Your wife has been gone 8 years, she said finally. Does she expect you to remain alone forever? I don't know what she expects. I only know that loving her was the best thing I ever did, and losing her was the worst. I swore I'd never risk that kind of pain again, and yet here you are, risking it. Jacob met her eyes, seeing his own confusion reflected there. Here I am. Thomas looked up from his reading, his young face bright with accomplishment. Papa, I read the whole story about the Good Samaritan, the man who helped the stranger even though they weren't the same kind of people. The irony wasn't lost on either adult. Jacob managed a genuine smile for his son. That's wonderful, Thomas. What did you think of the story? I think it's like us, Thomas said with the straightforward wisdom that sometimes surprised Jacob. Like how Ayana helped us even though we're different kinds of people. And now we're helping each other out of the mouths of babes. Jacob felt something ease in his chest at Thomas's innocent observation. His son didn't see betrayal in their growing bonds with Ayana. He saw kindness, connection, the natural human impulse to care for one another. You're right, Jacob said. It is like us. Ayana's smile was soft with affection for Thomas, but when her eyes met Jacob's again, he saw understanding there. She knew the battle he was fighting, the guilt and longing and fear all tangled up together. She was fighting her own version of the same struggle. I should check the horses, Jacob said abruptly, needing space to think, to breathe, to sort through the chaos of his emotions. In this storm? Ayana asked with concern. The barn's not far, and they need extra feed in this cold. He was already reaching for his heavy coat when Ayana caught his arm. Her touch burned through the wool of his shirt, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd felt a woman's gentle hand. Jacob, she said, using his first name for the first time. Don't punish yourself for feeling alive again." Her words followed him out into the driving snow, where the cold wind felt good against his flushed face. The barn was indeed close, connected to the cabin by a rope he'd strung for exactly this kind of weather. But the short walk gave him time to wrestle with the truth Ayana had spoken so simply. He was feeling alive again. After 8 years of merely surviving, of going through the motions of living without really engaging with life, Ayana's presence had awakened something in him he'd thought was buried with Sarah. Not just desire, though that was certainly part of it, but hope, joy, the possibility that his story wasn't over, that there might be chapters yet to write. The horses nickered softly as he entered the barn, grateful for the extra hay and the brief human company. Old Buck, his reliable gelding, nuzzled Jacob's shoulder with the kind of uncomplicated affection that animals offered so freely. "What do you think, old friend?" Jacob asked, scratching behind the horse's ears. "Am I losing my mind?" Buck had no answers, but his steady presence was comforting. Jacob took his time with the evening chores, checking water supplies, adjusting blankets, making sure his animals would be warm through the night. Simple, practical tasks that usually brought him peace. But tonight, his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to the woman who had somehow become essential to their daily happiness, to the photograph of Sarah that seemed to be asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. When he finally returned to the cabin, he found Thomas asleep at the table, his head pillowed on his arms beside the open Bible. Ayana sat nearby, working on her beadwork by lamplight, her presence watchful and protective. "He tried to wait for you," she said softly. "But the storm makes everyone sleepy." Jacob lifted his son gently, carrying him to the loft bed they shared. Thomas stirred slightly but didn't wake, exhausted by the day's lessons and the warm security of their snowbound haven. When Jacob climbed back down the ladder, he found Ayana banking the fire for the night, her movements efficient and domestic. She'd been staying later each evening as the winter deepened, sometimes not leaving until well after dark. Tonight, with the storm raging, he wondered if she should leave at all. "The snow's getting worse," he said. "Maybe you should stay tonight. The spare blankets are clean, and you could sleep by the fire." Ayana paused in her work, considering. "That would be proper." Jacob almost laughed at the question. Nothing about their situation was proper by conventional standards. A widowed white man, a displaced Cheyenne woman, a child who bridged both worlds. They were already so far outside social expectations that worrying about propriety seemed absurd. Thomas would be heartbroken. "If something happened to you in the storm," he said instead. "And we need you safe," she nodded slowly. "Then yes, I will stay." "Thank you." As they prepared separate sleeping spaces, Ayana near the hearth, Jacob in the loft beside Thomas, the intimacy of the arrangement felt both natural and terrifying. This was how families lived, sharing space and warmth and the quiet rituals of settling in for the night. But they weren't a family. They were 3 people thrown together by circumstance, connected by need and growing affection, but separated by a world that would never accept what they might become. Jacob lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind howl around their cabin walls and the soft breathing of the 2 people who had become more precious to him than he'd ever intended to allow. Sarah's photograph seemed to glow in the darkness beside him, a reminder of promises made and love lost. But for the first time in 8 years, he found himself wondering if love lost might also mean love found again. In the most unexpected of places, the broken wagon wheel, half buried in snow, told a story Jacob wished he'd never found. Its iron rim was twisted, spokes shattered, and the hub split clean through, the kind of damage that came from hitting rocks at speed, probably while fleeing something terrible. Scattered around it were the remnants of someone's dreams, a child's wooden doll with one arm missing, a woman's bonnet faded by weather, a man's boot with the sole worn through. "Stay close, Thomas," Jacob murmured, his rifle ready as he scanned the surrounding forest. They'd come down to the lower meadow to check his trap lines after 3 days of being cabin-bound, and Thomas had spotted something glinting in the snow. "What happened here, Papa?" Thomas asked, his young voice subdued by the evidence of tragedy around them. Settlers, Jacob replied grimly. Heading west, I'd guess. Something went wrong. Ayana, who had insisted on coming with them despite Jacob's protests, knelt beside the wagon wheel and touched it with gentle reverence. This happened recently, before the big snows, but not long. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If there had been trouble here recently, Indian raids, bandit attacks, or worse, it meant danger could still be lurking in these mountains. Danger that could threaten not just him, but Thomas and Ayana. We should go, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he heard voices coming through the trees. Told you we should have checked this area sooner. Track's been covered by snow for weeks. If there's survivors, they're long dead by now. Jacob grabbed Thomas and pulled him behind a fallen log, motioning for Ayana to do the same. Through the trees, he could see 3 men on horseback picking their way through the scattered debris. They wore the rough clothes of trappers or prospectors, but something about their manner set Jacob's teeth on edge. Look at this, one of them called out, dismounting near where a trunk had split open, spilling women's clothing across the snow. Might be something valuable left. Graves are already picked clean, another replied with casual cruelty. But check anyway. Never know what them settlers might have hid. Grave robbers. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. These men weren't searching for survivors or trying to help anyone. They were scavenging from the dead, profiting from tragedy. Thomas started to whisper a question, but Jacob pressed a finger to his lips, praying the boy would understand the need for absolute silence. Beside them, Ayana had gone completely still, her hand moving instinctively to her medicine pouch. "Hey, Caleb," the third man called from near the trees. "Come look at this." Fresh tracks. Jacob's blood turned to ice. Their own tracks leading from the cabin. In his concern about the wagon wheel, he'd been careless, not thinking about covering their trail. The man called Caleb walked over to examine the prints, his face hard and calculating. 3 people. Man, woman, child by the size of them. Recent too, maybe this morning. Locals. Got to be. Nobody else would be stupid enough to be out here in winter. Caleb's eyes scanned the forest, and Jacob had the horrible feeling the man was looking right at their hiding spot. Probably saw our smoke yesterday, came down to investigate. Think they saw anything? Don't matter what they saw. Matters what they might tell others. Caleb mounted his horse again, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. We find them, we make sure they don't talk about finding us here. The 3 men began following Jacob's trail back toward the cabin, and Jacob felt panic claw at his chest. These weren't just grave robbers, they were killers, and they were heading straight for his home. "Papa," Thomas breathed, barely audible. "Quiet, son. We're going to play a game. We're going to be invisible, like the deer when they hide from hunters." Jacob's mind raced through options. The men were mounted and armed, and they had a head start toward the cabin. Even if Jacob could circle around and get there first, he'd be outnumbered 3-1. And he had Thomas and Ayana to protect. But Ayana was already moving, slipping away from their hiding spot, with the silent grace of someone raised in the wilderness. Jacob caught her arm, shaking his head frantically, but she leaned close to whisper in his ear, "There's another trail to the cabin, longer, but hidden. I can lead them away while you get Thomas to safety." "No," Jacob hissed. "We stay together." "Look at me," she said urgently, her dark eyes fierce with determination. "I know these mountains better than you think. I can lose them in the deadfall on the North Ridge, circle back after dark. Ayana, your son needs his father alive, and I need to know you're both safe." She touched his face gently, a gesture so tender it made his heart break. "Trust me, Jacob Stone. I've been running from dangerous men for 3 years, before he could stop her." She was gone, moving through the trees with such skill that even Jacob lost sight of her within moments. Almost immediately, he heard her voice calling out from the wrong direction, away from where he and Thomas were hidden. "Help! Is someone there? I'm lost." The 3 men wheeled their horses toward the sound, taking the bait exactly as Ayana had hoped. Jacob heard Caleb curse and shout orders to his companions. Sounds like a woman. Probably the one from the tracks. Could be a trap. Could be information. Either way, We need to find her before she finds whoever she's with. The sound of horses crashing through underbrush faded as the men pursued Ayana's voice deeper into the forest. Jacob waited until he was certain they were gone, then lifted Thomas and began the careful journey back to their cabin by a route that avoided the main trail. "Is Ayana going to be okay?" Thomas asked as they moved through the trees. Jacob's throat was tight with fear and admiration. "She's smart and strong and knows these mountains well. She'll be fine." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The men they'd seen weren't just dangerous, they were desperate. Men who would rob graves and kill witnesses weren't likely to show mercy to a Cheyenne woman traveling alone. By the time they reached the cabin, Jacob's mind was made up. He settled Thomas inside with strict instructions to bar the door and not open it for anyone except Jacob or Ayana. Then he loaded his rifle, checked his pistol, and prepared to go after the woman who had become more important to him than his own safety. "Papa, don't go," Thomas pleaded. "Stay here where it's safe." Jacob knelt beside his son, seeing Sarah's eyes looking back at him with the same desperate love he'd seen 8 years ago when she'd begged him to be careful on a hunting trip. "Some things are worth the risk, son," he said quietly. "Some people are worth fighting for." As he stepped back into the cold mountain air, Jacob realized he was no longer the man who had built walls around his heart. Somewhere in the past few weeks, Ayana had become part of his family, part of his soul, and he would die before he let those men hurt her. The broken wagon wheel had brought death to his mountain. But Jacob Stone was done running from life. The military dispatch was still damp with snow when Jacob found it clutched in one of the dead grave robbers' hands. The man called Caleb lay sprawled beside a pine tree, his neck broken from a fall no horse could have caused. And Jacob felt a chill of recognition as he read the official document, confidential military communique from Colonel Morrison. Fort Collins 2, all regional commands. RE Cheyenne War. Chief Bear Claw, increased hostile activity reports indicate. The renegade known as Bear Claw has been conducting raids against settler families along the Colorado Territory frontier. His band, estimated at 20-30 warriors, has been responsible for at least 6 homestead attacks in the past 2 months. Bear Claw is seeking revenge for the death of his family at Sand Creek. Of particular concern, intelligence suggests Bear Claw's sister, known as Ayana, or Eternal Blossom, may be operating as a scout for his raids. She was educated at the Colorado Springs Mission School and speaks fluent English. Approach with extreme caution. Description: female, approximately 25 years, medium height, traditional dress with distinctive beadwork. Maybe traveling alone or with small groups. Consider extremely dangerous. Reward: $500 for information leading to capture. $1,000 for Bear Claw himself, dead or alive. Jacob's hands trembled as he read the dispatch twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow change. But they remained stubbornly clear, turning his world upside down with their implications. Ayana was Bear Claw's sister. The woman who had taught his son to read, who had become precious to both of them, who had just risked her life to save theirs. She was the sister of one of the most feared war chiefs on the frontier. The sound of approaching footsteps made Jacob fold the dispatch quickly and slip it inside his coat. Ayana emerged from the trees, her buckskin dress torn and her face scratched from running through heavy brush, but alive and unharmed. "The other 2 got away," she reported, breathing heavily. "But this one, I heard him fall. His horse threw him against the rocks." Jacob studied her face, searching for signs of deception, for any hint that she was not who she claimed to be. But all he saw was the same woman who had patiently taught Thomas his letters, who had shared stories of her grandmother, who had looked at him with growing affection over these past weeks. "You killed him," Jacob said, his voice flat. "I defended myself." He was trying to... Ayana stopped, seeing something in Jacob's expression. "What's wrong? What happened?" Jacob wanted to ask her directly about the dispatch, about Bear Claw, about whether every moment of trust between them had been built on lies. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with fear and heartbreak. and the terrible possibility that everything he'd come to believe about her was false. "We should get back to Thomas," he said. Instead, they made the journey to the cabin in tense silence, Jacob's mind churning with questions and accusations he wasn't ready to voice. Ayana seemed to sense his withdrawal, glancing at him with growing concern, but she didn't press for explanations. Thomas flew into Ayana's arms the moment they entered the cabin, his young face bright with relief. "I was so scared. I heard gunshots and, are you hurt? Papa, is she hurt?" "I'm fine, little one," Ayana assured him, holding him close. "Just some scratches from the branches." Watching them together, seeing Thomas's obvious love for the woman who might be scouting his family for destruction, Jacob felt something break inside his chest. How could he have been so wrong about someone? How could his instincts have failed him so completely? "Thomas," he said, his voice harsher than intended, "go upstairs and get ready for supper." "But Papa, now." Thomas looked between his father and Ayana with confusion, sensing the sudden tension but not understanding its source. With reluctant obedience, he climbed the ladder to the loft, leaving the two adults alone. Jacob stood by the fireplace, not trusting himself to look at Ayana directly. The dispatch felt like it was burning through his coat, demanding acknowledgement, demanding truth. "Jacob," Ayana said softly, "something is wrong." "What happened out there?" "Tell me about your brother," he said without preamble. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob turned to face her and saw all the color drain from her face, saw her hand move instinctively to her medicine pouch, saw the trapped look of someone whose carefully guarded secret had just been exposed. "How did you—" she began, then stopped. "So it's true." Jacob's voice was barely controlled. "Bear Claw is your brother." Ayana sank into one of the wooden chairs as if her legs would no longer support her. "Yes," she whispered. "He is my brother. The same Bear Claw who's been raiding homesteads? Killing families? The one the military is hunting with $1,000 bounty on his head?" "Yes." The word was even quieter than before. Jacob felt the last of his trust crumble. "And you're his scout. You came here to learn our routines, our weaknesses, so he could, what, kill us in our sleep? Take Thomas captive? No!" Ayana leaped to her feet, her eyes blazing. "It's not like that. I would never. Jacob, you have to believe me." "Believe you?" Jacob's voice rose, all his mountain man's wariness flooding back. "I've been harboring the sister of a war chief." "Do you have any idea what that means? If the military finds out, if the townspeople in Bent Creek learn that I've been—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "That you've been what? Teaching me to read? Letting me care for your son? Treating me like a human being instead of a savage?" Ayana's voice carried 8 years of pain and isolation. "Yes, I know exactly what that means to your people." "Don't," Jacob warned. "Don't make this about my people versus your people. This is about lies. This is about you deceiving us, putting Thomas in danger. I never put Thomas in danger." Ayana's composure finally cracked. "Everything I've told you about myself is true. I was at the mission school. My family was killed by soldiers. I've been alone and running for 3 years, running with your brother's war party. Running from my brother's war party." She shouted, then clapped her hand over her mouth as if shocked by her own volume. From the loft came Thomas's frightened voice. "Papa!" "Ayana, why are you yelling?" "It's all right, son," Jacob called up, though nothing felt all right. "Just adult talk. Try to sleep." Ayana had sunk back into the chair, her head in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was broken. "You want the truth, Jacob Stone? Here is the truth. My brother has been consumed by grief and rage since Sand Creek. He blames all white people for our family's death, and he's determined to make them pay. And you support that?" "I understand it. There's a difference." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When the soldiers came to our winter camp, when they killed our grandmother and our cousins and children babies, Bear Claw lost more than family. He lost his soul." Jacob felt his anger waver, replaced by unwilling sympathy. He'd heard stories about Sand Creek, though he'd tried not to listen. Massacre, some called it. Justice, others claimed. "But you don't support the raids," he said, wanting to understand. "I've been trying to find him for 2 years, to talk him out of this path of revenge." I tracked his movements, followed the reports of his raids, always arriving too late. Ayana's voice grew steadier. That's how I ended up in these mountains. I followed rumors that he'd been seen in the high country, and instead you found us. Instead I found Thomas, crying in a snowstorm, needing help. She met Jacob's eyes directly. And everything changed. Jacob wanted to believe her. Every instinct that had grown to trust her over these weeks was crying out that she was telling the truth, that the woman who had taught his son with such patience and kindness couldn't be capable of the deception he feared. But the dispatch in his coat was evidence of a larger, more dangerous world than their small cabin could contain. Even if Ayana was innocent of any intent to harm them, her presence here put them all at risk. If Bearclaw finds out you're here, Jacob said slowly, if he discovers you've been helping a white family, he'll disown me or kill me. Yes, I know. And if the military finds out I've been sheltering his sister, they'll arrest you as a traitor. Or worse. Ayana's voice was steady now, resigned. I know that too. They stared at each other across the cabin that had become a sanctuary for all of them, both understanding that the outside world was closing in whether they wanted it or not. You have to leave, Jacob said finally, the words tearing at his heart. Tonight, before anyone else comes looking. I know, Ayana whispered. I've always known this day would come. From the loft, Thomas's voice drifted down. Ayana, will you read me a story before bed? Both adults closed their eyes, sharing the pain of what they were about to lose. Jacob's wedding ring had lived on his finger for 15 years, 8 with Sarah, 7 without her. The simple gold band had grown thin from wear, inscribed inside with words he'd never learned to read until Ayana taught him. Forever, my love, S. Now as he worked it off his finger in the pre-dawn darkness, it felt like he was removing the last chain that bound him to the past. 3 hours had passed since Ayana had climbed to the loft to read Thomas one final bedtime story. Jacob had listened to her gentle voice carrying down the children's tale about a brave rabbit who learned to trust a fox, both of them knowing it was goodbye disguised as normalcy. When she'd climbed back down, her eyes had been red with suppressed tears. But her resolve was firm. She would leave at first light, disappear back into the mountains, take the danger she represented away from the family she'd come to love. It was the only way to keep Jacob and Thomas safe. But Jacob had spent those 3 sleepless hours staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a truth that cut deeper than any physical pain. Losing Ayana would destroy something precious in all their lives. Not just her teaching, not just her companionship, but the hope she'd brought back to his world, the possibility that love could bloom again, that trust could bridge any divide, that a broken family could be made whole. The ring slipped off his finger and lay heavy in his palm, catching the dying firelight like a fallen star. Such a small thing to carry so much weight, so much history. Sarah had placed it there with promises of forever, and he'd kept those promises as best he could. But forever with Sarah was over, and another kind of forever was calling to him now. You're awake, Ayana said softly from her makeshift bed by the hearth. Jacob turned to find her watching him, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the dim light, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the strong woman who had faced down armed grave robbers and killed to protect his family. Couldn't sleep, he admitted. Too much thinking. About what we discussed? About me leaving. Jacob closed his fist around the wedding ring, feeling its edges bite into his palm. About what happens next? Ayana sat up, pulling the quilt around herself like armor. What happens next is that I disappear. You and Thomas go back to your life before I complicated everything. In time, he'll forget about reading lessons and focus on the important things you're teaching him, will he? Because I think you underestimate how much you've changed us. Jacob moved closer to the dying fire, needing its warmth. Thomas asked me yesterday if we were going to be a family, you, him, and me. He said it felt like we already were. The pain that crossed Ayana's face was visible even in the dim light. Children see what they want to see. They don't understand about the world's rules, about what's possible and what isn't. Maybe that's their strength. Jacob held up the ring so she could see it. This has been on my finger since I was 20 years old. I thought I'd die wearing it, thought being Sarah's husband was the only identity I'd ever have. Jacob, don't let me finish. His voice was quiet but firm. I loved my wife with everything I had. She was my first love, my only love, and when I lost her I thought that was the end of my story. But you've shown me something different. You've shown me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It changes, it grows, it finds new places to take root. Ayana shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. It doesn't matter what we feel. My brother is out there somewhere, probably getting closer every day. The military is hunting both of us now. Even if we wanted to try, what if we didn't run? The words surprised Jacob as much as they seemed to surprise Ayana. But once spoken, they felt right, like a path he'd been walking toward without realizing it. What do you mean? She asked, cautiously. Jacob began pacing the small cabin, his mind working through possibilities he'd never considered before. Running means always looking over our shoulders, always afraid, always separated. What if instead we face this together? What if we found a way to make it work? Jacob, you're not thinking clearly. The risks. I've spent 8 years avoiding risk, keeping Thomas and myself isolated because I thought that meant safety. But you know what I learned these past few weeks? Safety isn't about hiding from the world. It's about having people you can count on, people worth fighting for. Ayana stood, the quilt falling away from her shoulders. She wore the simple dress she'd arrived in that first day, but to Jacob, she looked like the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, not because of her appearance, but because of her strength, her courage, her capacity to love despite everything the world had taken from her. Even if we could find a way to be together, she said desperately. What about Bear Claw? What about my brother who will never accept that I've chosen to love his enemies? Then we convince him otherwise. You don't know him, Jacob. The man I loved as a brother died at Sand Creek along with our family. What's left is rage and grief and a need for revenge that consumes everything else. Jacob moved closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the sage and sweetgrass that always seemed to surround her. You said you've been tracking him for 2 years, trying to talk him out of his warpath. What if you had help? What if you had someone willing to stand with you, to face him together? He would kill you on sight, maybe, or maybe seeing you with someone who loves you. Seeing Thomas, a child caught between 2 worlds but belonging fully to both, maybe that would remind him of who he used to be. Hope flickered across Ayana's features before fear smothered it again. It's too dangerous. I won't risk your lives on a possibility. And I won't let you walk away because we're afraid of possibilities. Jacob took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were, how she trembled despite her outward composure. Ayana, these past weeks with you have been the happiest Thomas and I have known since Sarah died. Not just because you taught us to read, but because you made us feel like a family again. Jacob, I love you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. I didn't plan to, didn't want to, fought against it with everything I had. But I love you, and I think you love me too. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. Of course I love you. Both of you. But love isn't always enough. It's a start, though. It's something to build on, something worth fighting for. Jacob lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. Stay, help me figure out how to make this work. Help me find your brother and see if there's any part of him left that can be reached. From the loft came a small voice. Papa, is everything all right? Jacob and Ayana looked up to see Thomas peering down at them, his young face serious with the wisdom that came from being raised in an adult world full of dangerous complications. Come down, son, Jacob said quietly. There's something we need to talk about. Thomas climbed down the ladder in his nightshirt, his sandy hair standing up at odd angles. He went directly to Ayana and took her hand, as if sensing she needed comfort. You're crying, he observed with the directness of childhood. Are you sad? A little, Ayana admitted, kneeling to bring herself to his eye level. Thomas, there are some things about me that I never told you. Some things that might make it dangerous for me to stay here. Thomas considered this with 8-year-old gravity. Like what? Jacob watched as Ayana struggled with how much truth to share with the child. How to explain the complexities of war and family and divided loyalties to someone who saw the world in clearer terms than any adult. "My brother is angry at white people," she said finally. "Very angry. And some white people are angry at him. If they find out I'm here, they might hurt all of us, so you have to leave. I think it would be safer." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his small hand still clasped in Ayana's larger one. When he spoke, his words came with the devastating honesty that children wielded like weapons of truth. When Mama died, Papa was angry too. Angry at God, angry at the sickness, angry at everything. And you know what happened? "What happened?" Ayana asked gently. "We got smaller and smaller. Papa stopped talking to people in town, stopped going to church, stopped doing anything except work and worry. We came up here to hide, and we got so small that sometimes I felt like we might disappear completely." Jacob felt his throat tighten. He'd never realized that Thomas had seen their isolation so clearly, had understood the cost of his father's protective fear. "But then you came," Thomas continued, "and we started getting bigger again. Papa laughs now and talks to you about important things, and I'm learning to read stories that make the whole world feel bigger and more wonderful." He looked between the two adults with earnest determination. "If you leave, we'll get small again, all of us. Even you." The simple truth of it hit both Jacob and Ayana like a physical blow. This child, who had been raised on the edges of a harsh world, understood something that the adults had been too frightened to acknowledge. Isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of death. "What do you think we should do?" Jacob asked his son. Thomas didn't hesitate. "I think we should be brave. I think we should stay together and figure out how to make the angry people not angry anymore." He looked at Ayana with absolute faith. "And I think your brother might not be as angry as you think if he met us and saw how much we love each other." Jacob felt the last of his resistance crumble. Out of the mouths of babes came wisdom that adults spent years trying to rediscover. His son was right. They belonged together, whatever the cost, whatever the risk. He opened his palm and showed them both the wedding ring that had bound him to the past. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he set it on the mantelpiece beside Sarah's photograph. "Then we stay together," he said. "And tomorrow we start figuring out how to find Bear Claw." The peace pipe was older than memory, carved from red stone by Bear Claw's great-grandfather and passed down through generations of war chiefs and medicine men. Ayana held it with trembling hands as her brother and 5 mounted warriors emerged from the tree line like spirits materializing from smoke. The sacred pipe represented their last hope for avoiding bloodshed, their final chance to bridge 2 worlds that seemed destined for war. "Sister," Bear Claw's voice carried across the clearing like winter wind, cold, hard, stripped of the warmth she remembered from their childhood. He sat tall on his war pony, his face painted with symbols of grief and rage, his eyes holding no recognition of the woman who had once braided flowers in his hair and sung him to sleep with their grandmother's lullabies. Jacob stood beside her, his rifle within easy reach, but deliberately not in his hands. Behind them, Thomas pressed close to his father's leg, trying to be brave despite the fear that radiated from his small body. The boy had insisted on being present for this confrontation, arguing with the fierce logic of childhood that families face danger together. "My brother," Ayana replied in Cheyenne, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I have been looking for you." "Looking for me?" Bear Claw's laugh was bitter as winter bark. "Or leading the white soldiers to me. I know you have been living among them, sister. I know you have forgotten the blood of our people." The warriors behind him shifted restlessly, their weapons ready, their eyes fixed on Jacob with the particular hatred reserved for the enemies who had stolen their land and slaughtered their families. Ayana could feel the violence crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. "I have forgotten nothing," she said, switching to English so Jacob could understand. "I remember our grandmother's songs, our mother's laughter, the way our father taught us to read The Flight of Eagles." But I also remember what you have forgotten, that our people were taught to show mercy, to protect the innocent, to see the humanity in all of creation. Bear Claw's war pony danced sideways, responding to his rider's tension. Humanity? His English was rough but clear, learned in the same mission school that had taught Ayana. Where was humanity when the soldiers came to Sand Creek? Where was mercy when they killed our babies, our elders, our women heavy with child? Jacob stepped forward slightly, his movement careful and non-threatening. I wasn't there, he said quietly. I didn't kill your family. And neither did my son. Your son? Bear Claw's gaze shifted to Thomas, and something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. This white child lives in my sister's heart. Yes, Ayana said simply, as she lives in his. As his father lives in mine. The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Bear Claw studied Jacob's weathered face, seeing perhaps the same gentleness that had won Ayana's trust, the same strength that had built a safe haven in these harsh mountains. You love this white man, Bear Claw said, his voice filled with something that might have been grief. The eagle feather was pristine white, tipped with gold, a sacred gift that Bear Claw had carried into battle for 3 years without ever offering it to another soul. Now he held it reverently in both hands, his painted face soft with an emotion Jacob had never expected to see in the feared war chief, hope. This feather came from the eagle that circled our camp on the day you were born. Little sister, Bear Claw said, his voice gentler than it had been since he'd arrived. Our grandmother said it was a sign that you would soar between 2 worlds, bringing wisdom to both. Ayana's tears fell freely now, her composure finally broken by this glimpse of the brother she remembered. I thought you had thrown away all of grandmother's teachings. I buried them beneath my anger, but I never threw them away. Bear Claw looked at Thomas, who stood between his father and Ayana, with the quiet courage of a child who had learned to trust in love's power, to overcome fear. This boy, he reads the old stories? He reads many stories now, Ayana said proudly, in English and some words in our language too. He learns quickly, like you did when we were children. Bear Claw knelt to bring himself to Thomas's eye level, the movement causing several of his warriors to shift uneasily. Their war chief had not shown such gentleness to anyone in years, especially not to a white child. What is your name, young reader? Bear Claw asked. Thomas Stone, the boy replied without hesitation. But Ayana calls me little brother sometimes. Something profound shifted in Bear Claw's expression at those words. Little brother, he repeated softly. She called me that once, when I was not much older than you. Jacob watched this interaction with growing amazement. The man who had terrorized the frontier for 3 years, who had burned homesteads and taken countless lives in his quest for revenge, was being disarmed by an 8-year-old boy's innocent acceptance of love, transcending racial boundaries. Would you like to learn about this feather? Bear Claw asked Thomas, holding up the sacred object. Would you like to hear the story your sister learned when she was your age? Thomas nodded eagerly, settling cross-legged on the ground as Bear Claw began to speak in the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. The eagle sees all things from his place in the sky, Bear Claw began, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone their grandmother had used. He sees the white man's settlements and the Indian camps. He sees the soldiers and the warriors, the children and the elders. But most important, he sees the connections between all living things, the threads of kinship that bind every creature to every other. As Bear Claw spoke, Jacob found himself drawn into the story, despite his lack of familiarity with Cheyenne traditions. There was something universal in the tale, something that spoke to the fundamental truth Thomas had voiced that morning, that love was stronger than the artificial divisions humans created. When the eagle drops a feather, Bear Claw continued, it is giving a piece of its sacred vision to the earth. The person who receives such a gift is blessed with the eagle's sight, the ability to see beyond surface differences to the truth beneath. He held the feather out to Thomas, who looked questioningly at Jacob before reaching for it. But receiving the eagle's vision comes with responsibility, Bear Claw warned gently. The bearer must use this site to bring peace, to heal wounds, to build bridges between peoples who have forgotten. They are all part of the same creation, Thomas accepted the feather with the solemnity of someone who understood he was being given something precious beyond measure. I'll take good care of it, he promised. I know you will, little brother. Bearclaw's use of the kinship term was deliberate, a formal adoption that carried weight in Cheyenne culture. He looked up at Jacob, his eyes holding a question. Jacob understood what was being asked. By accepting his son's symbolic adoption into Bearclaw's family, he would be acknowledging bonds that went far deeper than the temporary alliance they were negotiating. He would be saying that Thomas belonged not just to the Stone family, but to the broader human family that included all of Ayana's people. I'm honored, Jacob said simply, and meant it. Bearclaw stood, his attention turning to one of his warriors who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Yellow Hawk, ride to the other bands. Tell them Bearclaw has made peace with his sister's chosen family. Any who wish to continue the warpath must find another leader. The warrior's face showed surprise and concern. And if they ask why you have abandoned the path of vengeance? Bearclaw looked at Ayana, at Jacob, at Thomas carefully holding his eagle feather, and Jacob saw the exact moment when the war chief's transformation became complete. Tell them I remembered what our grandmothers taught us, Bearclaw said, that some things are more powerful than hatred. Tell them I found my sister again, and through her eyes I saw that not all white people are our enemies. Some are capable of love that crosses all boundaries. He turned back to Ayana, his voice thick with emotion. Will you forgive me, sister, for the years I spent choosing anger over wisdom? For the pain I caused our people by leading them down a path that could only end in more death? Ayana threw her arms around her brother, both of them weeping for the lost years, the unnecessary suffering, the walls that pride and grief had built between them. There is nothing to forgive, she whispered. There is only love, and the chance to build something better from what remains. Jacob felt his own throat tighten as he watched the reunion he had never dared to hope for. Thomas stepped close to his father, still clutching his eagle feather, his young face bright with the joy of witnessing love's triumph over hatred. Papa, Thomas whispered, we're all family now, aren't we? Jacob looked at his son, at the woman he loved, at the brother who had chosen peace over vengeance, and felt his heart expand to encompass possibilities he had never imagined. Yes, son, he said, his voice rough with gratitude. We're all family now. The schoolhouse stood in the meadow where they had once found the broken wagon wheel, its log walls golden in the spring sunshine and its roof gleaming with fresh cedar shingles. Jacob had insisted on building it there, on ground that had witnessed tragedy, as a symbol of hope growing from loss. Bearclaw had helped him raise the walls, their combined labor-healing wounds that words alone could never mend. Mama would have loved this, Thomas said, as he arranged wooden letters on the small desks Jacob had crafted through the winter months. At 10 years old now, he moved with the quiet confidence of a child who had never doubted his place in a world that embraced him completely. Ayana looked up from where she was, organizing the precious books they had accumulated, donations from sympathetic families in Bent Creek, gifts from the mission school where she had once been a reluctant student, treasures discovered in abandoned homesteads. Her smile was radiant with contentment. She would have been proud of what we've built here, Ayana agreed, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly where their second child grew. A place where all children can learn together, regardless of the color of their skin or the language of their grandparents. Jacob paused in his work, hanging the last of the teaching slates, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of this moment. 2 years had passed since that morning when he'd found Ayana teaching Thomas to read. 2 years of challenges and changes that had transformed not just their small family, but the entire community around them. The schoolhouse now served children from 3 different worlds. White settler families who had overcome their initial suspicions. Cheyenne families from Bearclaw's band who had chosen the path of peace. And the growing number of mixed families like their own. Each morning brought a mixture of languages and traditions that somehow blended into a harmony more beautiful than any single voice could create alone. "The Martinez children will be here soon," Thomas announced, checking the position of the sun through the window. "And Running Deer said she would bring her little sister today for the first time." Jacob felt the familiar warmth of pride as he watched his son, no longer just his son, but brother to children from multiple tribes and cultures, prepare for another day of learning and teaching. Thomas had inherited Ayana's gift for education, often helping the younger students with their letters while mastering increasingly complex texts himself. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. Bearclaw rode at the head of a small group, his war paint replaced by the simple dress of a man at peace with his choices. Behind him rode several families, children chattering with excitement as they approached their school. Uncle Bear Claw brought more students, Thomas observed with satisfaction. Jacob smiled at his son's casual use of the kinship term. In the beginning, he had worried about Thomas's easy acceptance of such a complicated family structure. Now he understood that children were often wiser than adults about the things that truly mattered: love, acceptance, the willingness to see beyond surface differences to the heart beneath. Bearclaw dismounted and approached the schoolhouse. His weathered face creased with a smile that had become more frequent as the months passed. "Good morning, sister, brother, nephew." "Good morning," they replied in unison. The ritual greeting that started each school day. "I bring news from the territorial capital," Bearclaw announced, producing an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "The governor has formally recognized our school and authorized funding for supplies and teacher training." Ayana gasped, taking the document with trembling hands. "Official recognition? That means no one can close us down for teaching Indian children alongside white children," Jacob finished, his voice thick with emotion. "That means what we've built here has a future." The journey to this moment had not been easy. There had been opposition from some settlers who saw the integration as dangerous, criticism from tribal members who viewed cooperation with whites as betrayal, and bureaucratic obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. But they had persevered, supported by an ever-growing circle of families who believed in their vision of education transcending racial boundaries. "There's more," Bearclaw continued. "The Territorial Education Committee wants to use our school as a model for other regions. They're asking Ayana to train other teachers in our methods." Jacob looked at his wife. They had married the previous spring in a ceremony that blended Cheyenne traditions with Christian vows, and saw the same mixture of excitement and trepidation he felt. Success brought new opportunities, but also new responsibilities and challenges. "What do you think?" he asked her. Ayana's hand moved to her belly, then to Thomas's shoulder, encompassing all the life they had created together. "I think our grandmother's vision is coming true. The eagle's sight is spreading, helping others see beyond old divisions to new possibilities." As if summoned by her words, an eagle circled overhead, its cry echoing across the mountain meadow. Thomas looked up and waved. The sacred feather Bearclaw had given him now, woven into his hair in a blend of cultural traditions that seemed as natural as breathing. "Let's begin today's lessons," Ayana announced, as the children gathered around the schoolhouse steps. "Today we're going to read about bridges, how they're built, why they're important, and what happens when people choose to cross them instead of burning them down." Jacob watched his expanding family settle into the rhythm of learning, each child contributing their unique perspective to the day's discussions. The broken wagon wheels still lay partially visible in the tall grass beyond the school, a reminder of dreams destroyed by hatred and fear. But rising above it was this new structure they had built, together, a testament to the power of love to create something beautiful from the fragments of loss. As the morning progressed and young voices rose in recitation and discussion, Jacob reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been a man afraid of change, convinced that isolation meant safety, suspicious of anyone different from himself. Now he was part of something larger and more wonderful than he had ever imagined possible. A family, a community, a vision of what the world could become when people chose understanding over fear. Some moments change everything we thought we knew about the world. For Jacob Stone, that moment had come when he walked through his cabin door to find a Cheyenne woman teaching his son to read. Now watching that same woman guide a classroom full of children from multiple cultures toward a shared future, he understood that the best changes were the ones that seemed impossible until they became inevitable. The eagle circled once more and flew toward the distant peaks, carrying with it the promise that some stories never truly end. They simply grow into something larger than anyone dared to dream.